I'm Dr. Scott Masson here with Paideia today, and my colleague and friend, Dr. Bill Friesen. We are looking today at Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, medieval tale. Last time we left off with some various discussions of the introductory features of this tale, and we left off in a way that I'm going to now hand over to Dr. Friesen to carry us forward. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Dr. Masson. Yes, this will be our third and final installment on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, before moving on to the realms of Chaucer. And as some of you may recall, we were discussing the arrival of Gawain at the castle of Sir Bersilac, and how he had been welcomed there. And we talked about the two women that Gawain met there, the one beautiful and the other one not so much. And we had another game proposed, the second great game of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and this is sometimes referred to as the hunting game. And it was proposed that whatever Sir Bersilac would win in the wild woods and spaces around his castle, he would turn over to Gawain, but Gawain in turn would turn over whatever he had won, whatever spoils he had won in the court while Sir Bersilac was away, which, as we noted last time, was a bit of a sketchy proposition, because it's not made clear exactly what Sir Gawain would be capturing, hunting down in the castle, but it was implied that it was perhaps something a little bit on the risque side. And we didn't discuss the hunts themselves, nor the upcoming seduction scenes. We have 3 hunts and 3 seduction scenes, which are obviously meant to be paired off one against the other. And we did talk, however, a little bit about this too was sealed not as merely an agreement, but that the language of the covenant was again invoked, which is extremely important to understanding the violations that occur and the punishments that derive from them. Now, we can't really talk at length about medieval hunting practices, but I should mention a few things very, very briefly at the front end here. A lot of people are unaware that during the Middle Ages, meat was obviously something that was very much valued amongst the community, and that some of this was raised domestically, to be sure. In fact, there was a fair amount of it that was raised domestically. But what we tend to lose sight of nowadays is that also a lot of the game that was brought in, the meat that was brought in by hunting. And the person who was usually tasked in the community with hunting and who had the resources with which to do it were the nobles in the area. To this very day, hunting is seen very much as an aristocratic undertaking in England, and it's tied to the long, long tradition that goes back into the dark mists of history. So, when Sir Bersilac goes out hunting, he is doing something intrinsically aristocratic. It's part of a social section to which Gawain himself actually belongs. Now, there's a few other things we probably need to note here. It's at this juncture in the text where it is mentioned to Sir Gawain also that the Green Chapel, where he has to meet the Green Knight, is actually close at hand. And so the danger of Gawain not fulfilling his first covenant when it comes to the beheading game seems to be alleviated, at least in terms of him finding the place where he can fulfill his promises.
Right.
So the pressure is off, and Gawain, for the first time in the text, is allowed to dally somewhat. And it's a very dangerous dalliance that he undertakes here. Was there something by way of introduction to the hunts and the seductions that you wanted to say, Dr. Masson?
Well, I think we're going to get into the specifics of the hunts and the animals that were hunted, and those sorts of features, and the way in which the scenes are presented, I think. But I think those are best done by looking at them specifically there.
Sure.
I don't know if there's any significance to the fact that there are 3 hunts. The number 3 is this, I mean, whenever one deals with numbers, the question of why that particular number, if it has any significance, comes to the fore. For a Christian poet, 3 has connotations of the Trinity, but also the 3 days of the, death and resurrection of Christ. Is it that any connection there? Who knows? the three temptations, maybe even of Peter, the three denials, this sort of thing.
Yes, I think you've done a very good job in previous podcasts of underscoring the fact that the medieval imagination is not just enormously figurative and allegorical and symbolic and very alive to icons and iconographic significance, but it's also tied up with that whole package, that whole worldview, is their fascinations with numbers and numerology and all the things that tie into that. And you've just signaled here that this has in the Middle Ages, this has a theological, a Christian foundation that is, of course, connected first and foremost with the Gospels and the narrative there and the events in there. Nobody's going to simply mention three and move on. We saw also that the Gawain poet is himself extremely interested in numbers. When we had that discussion about the pentangle and the five this and that and the five the other thing, if we look at the careful balancing of fits and stanzas and mentions of red and green and so on and so forth, we probably have to give a fair amount of significance to the fact that it's 3 on 3, 3 hunts and 3 seduction scenes. Precisely what that means is more difficult to say, and I think we talked about this in our previous podcast, where a lot of people make very bold, solid assertions about numbers and symbolic significance and things like this in stories like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in particular. Whereas we don't really have strong evidence, in my view, for saying that. And instead, we have to say that a lot of this potential significance, in this case, the significance of the 3 on 3, is highly allusive. It enriches the text enormously, but it stops of being clear and prescriptive and anything like this.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm a non-expert, but that doesn't matter per se. I'm not sure the experts have any closer understanding of exactly what something means. They might have a better understanding of what it might mean because they will be aware of the possibilities that other writers use for those same sorts of features like number, and so it will bring to mind what another author does with this number, and that enriches the text. But again, that doesn't conclude that this is how that number is to be read. But the significance of numbers in general, we just simply need to note that for the medieval mind, and not just the medieval mind, but for even the ancient mind, they think that number is part of the tapestry of reality, and that's why they associate number with astronomy and music and so forth, and why number arithmetic is part of the quadrivium. It's one of the ways in which we understand reality. And so they just simply add to that some of the significance of the numbers that come up in scripture. So they add a theological aspect to it, but so it's not just a Christian imposition. That's what I wanted to say here. It is a belief that reality really has certain features, and that if we want to present truth, then we should cleave more closely to those numbers and those features as well. That's my general statement about the subject.
Yes, and you've noted in the past that, that many of these texts here are encyclopedic in nature and worldview. And that also signals the fact that they like to codify these sorts of things, even if only speculatively. And when it comes to the hunts here today, it turns out, perhaps quite predictably, if you know the medieval mind, that there is indeed a handbook that can help us decode certain levels of significance in this text. And this is a text, well, it starts off like this. I'm going to try to move through this very briefly here. Nowadays, we call these things bestiaries or bestiaries. Excellent. And these derive ultimately from a text that was written in the late antique period known as the Physiologus. It's a very esoteric text, but it turns out it was a relatively influential text. And this was something perhaps anachronistically ascribed to this individual, whereby it was a sort of a catalog. So the Physiologus catalogs as many things as possible in nature, and it breaks them down according to not so much the spiritual, but particularly the animal and the vegetable and the mineral and all that kind of stuff. But particularly it focuses on the animal aspect of things. And it basically tells you about the features, the nature, the characteristics, much of which is wildly preposterous. But that doesn't matter very much to the medieval mind because they're concerned with the symbolic and allegorical significance of the creatures being talked about. I think, and I might be getting this wrong, so don't quote me on this. I think then later on, Isidore himself gets his hands on the Physiologus, and he injects the text for the animals with theological and allegorical significance. The creature means something and has certain habits which have spiritual significance if you read them figuratively and stuff like this.
Like a pelican.
Yes, like the pelican. So for instance, the pelican is said to, when its chicks are young and food is scarce, it is said to stab its own chest with its bill so that the blood can feed its young. And in this sense, the pelican is associated with the church, which suffers for the sake of its people and so on and so forth. Does the pelican actually do this? I think your average medieval would say that you're kind of missing the point. It's a symbol in this case here. It's not literally that it's doing
and
something.
so I've seen them pelicans cast on the inside of medieval cathedrals and so forth. There's little pictures of pelicans and think, what's with the pelicans? And that's it. It's a Christ figure, right?
Exactly.
Feed on the blood of Christ, etc. Yeah.
Right. So there are numerous medieval bestiaries that have survived to us. They're not an uncommon text at all. There was clearly a fascination with these sorts of topics, and reading the iconography of particular animals in spiritual ways, which was very interesting, obviously, to a large number of people because these books are being produced and produced and produced. So probably the best example, if our listeners want to pursue this here, if you type in the Aberdeen Bestiary, University of Aberdeen, they have a wonderful website which gives you all sorts of different aspects and levels and layers of this text, which they have there out online now, and it's open access, and it's very, very interesting. It's translated, which is going to help obviously the majority of our listeners, and a lot of the illuminated portrayals of the creatures survive to us. Some have been stolen, but many of them survive in the text. So it's an interesting little handbook. And you find these sorts of handbooks for symbolic and figurative interpretation all over the place during the medieval period. So it's not that we're operating completely blind when it comes to, for instance, numerology or iconography and things like that. We have a lot of things to help us along.
So this is going to play into not just the way in which the narrative is populated with beasts, but the significance of the beasts, and also in light of what we said last time about this is a Christian text, and yet it's dealing with a mythology that is pre-Christian. How do those things relate? Like the Green Knight, what exactly does the Green Knight signify in his person? Is there a Christian significance to the knight himself, or is he a pagan figure? All of those things are going to get pulled in to the web of interpretation here. And I'm not entirely convinced that it's clear what is being said in the text, even in relation to the things. But we'll come to that, and maybe you will help alleviate me of my confusion on this subject. But how about we move on with the hunts and the 3 days? And there are 3 days, right? And 3 hunts.
Yeah, and so first of all, we have that clear distinction between the world of the court and its sensibilities and the world of the wild, the world of nature, into which Berslac goes and then he returns. And of course,
but you said that very interesting phrase, the wild. Now, so the nature is not a Wordsworthian nature. It's not a place where we find the presence of God. It's a wild. It's a place that's untamed. It's a place that shows the consequences of a fallen world to some degree. Like it's a foreboding place.
I think we need to resist. There are 2 extremes, I think, usually when students approach discussions of nature in the Renaissance period, in the late medieval period or high medieval period, and in the early medieval period, and sometimes even when we're discussing ancient texts. On the one hand, you mentioned Wordsworth, which is interesting because Wordsworth and the Romantics more generally give us this idealized, almost sacralized understanding of nature and how nature works and how it's somehow purer than all things human and urbane and stuff like that. And so this tends to be the more common way in which nature is read in these texts by modern students and often, sadly, teachers and professors as well. And the texts themselves don't support that reading.
So they're blind. They interpret the word green as something positive that we ought to be on side with, etc., and not recognizing that the color green has multiple significances, and none of them include what we mean by green and by nature there. And so
No.
there's a really interesting book by C.S. Lewis called Studies in Words, in which he looks at the word nature and demonstrates exactly what you're saying here, that the word nature, as we understood it, is not that which historically held at all.
No, and then we have the other, we have a subset of professors and teachers and students who take it to the opposite extreme, where the medieval mind is looking out upon nature with a sense of almost existential dread and terror, and they don't dare have anything to do with it, and they're frightened of the forests and this place where Satan lives or something like this. And that too is not supported by the texts. We have a very complicated middle ground where we have to sort of situate ourselves and try to see as medieval readers and authors would have seen. And that's a challenging task, no doubt, but it's also a very rewarding task. So we see Bergerac go out from this civilized courtly world. In fact, I'm going to start using the word courtly instead of civilized, because civilized is a little anachronistic here.
Begs the question.
He encounters great violence when he goes out there. Things get killed, and he himself is very much at risk in at least one of these hunts. But on the other hand, he himself is a violent individual, and he can get by out there. He is equipped to deal with this world, this violent natural world. So it's neither idyllic nor is it
demonic.
Demonic, thank you. Sure, let's go with that. It's the middle way, and so we've got this clear distinction that's setting up the tone for reading in either place, the courtly tone in the castle itself, and this rather more wild tone when we go out there. Some people also like to make a very clear distinction between the courtly world being the feminine world and the external, the wild world outside as being the masculine world. And I think that works elusively only up to a point. Yes, we see a shift to feminine concerns during the high medieval period, and much of that is bound up with
courtly love, right? And
the court and the new form of love that's being celebrated in the art. And so, yes, there's a very complex set of feminine concerns that come to the fore during the high medieval period that were not there during the early medieval period. So fair enough, I take the point there. We also have that ancient distinction from the Romans largely, though also to some extent from the Greeks, that it is the expected role of the man of the household to go out into the world and do certain things, whether it's hunting in this case, or whether it's working, or whether it's leading in some kind of leadership position or something like this. And so there's that traditional distinction there as well. It is, but again, this distinction between the wild masculine world and the courtly feminine world, again, tends to be sometimes exaggerated too much. And I don't know that that's helpful to students.
No.
So, shall we get to the hunts themselves?
Let's hunt.
Okay.
First hunt, first day.
The first hunt, it is the stag, which
is,
again, the most conventional creature of them all. And it's a challenging hunt, to be sure, as it must have been, no doubt, in real life. But they are ultimately successful. And when it comes to the stag, this is where the author, I don't think we can call it geeking out, but the author really is at pains to show that he has hands-on knowledge of how to handle hunting and field dressing animals and things like this. This is what demonstrates that this person isn't writing in some abstract sense about hunting as a practice that he has heard about or something. He clearly knows exactly what he's on about.
Yeah, he's done it and seen it. Yeah.
Seems to relish this aspect of things. So keen huntsman was our author, I think. But the stag is taken down, and here we also might want to start opening things up in terms of the symbolic significance of the stag. That is,
what is the heraldic significance of a stag, Bill? It's
got it written down here, translated version, and this is from the Aberdeen Bestiary. The stag is a symbol for Christ, who tramples and destroys the devil. As the stag crossing a river helps, as stags crossing a river help each other, so should Christians crossing from the worldly life to the spiritual life help others who grow tired or weak. As the stag is renewed and sheds its horns after drinking from the spring, so those who drink from the spring of the Spirit are renewed and shed their sins.
Hmm.
Your entry for the stag.
Hmm.
So the stag is, in terms of the theological nobility or righteousness or wholesomeness of what we're looking at here, of the three creatures that get hunted, he is the highest. He is associated directly with Christ on the first day. And we see that not only is he associated with Christ, but the violence the stag is said to do, trampling and destroying the devil. It is said, I haven't read it here because it was going to get too ponderous. It is said in the entry in the bestiary, or the bestiary as I should call it, that stags trample on serpents whenever they can find them. They stomp on their heads with their hooves and kill them anytime they can catch a viper.
Excellent.
Do actually do that? No, they probably don't.
Mustangs do.
What's that?
Horses do.
Yes, horses kill snakes systematically. That is true. But stags, I don't know.
I'm not sure either.
In any event, they're also said to help each other when they're swimming across rivers, using their antlers to hold up those who are weak and beginning to falter, and that's where this reference comes from. Anyway, if you're asking whether or not these animals actually do this stuff out in real nature, you've missed the point of the bestiary. But we have, at the end of the day, a very theologically noble creature that is hunted down and killed. But on the other hand, it is pure, and that's what's brought back to the court. Then the question is, how do you want to align that with the first attempted seduction scene? Do you want to say something about that, Scott?
Oh, yeah, sure. Give me the hard bit. Well, other than to say that the seduction scene takes place very surprisingly to the reader, I think, when you first read this, that the lady should sneak in. And we should say something about that as well. He would be on a bed, which would be a four-poster with the curtains around it, and he would also, my understanding, in the Middle Ages, he would have slept naked as well. So to add to the intrigue, Gawain does not have a stitch of clothing on, and the lady has snuck into his bedchamber in a way that is rather unambiguous. Actually, it's entirely there's a threat to his moral nature here, which the reader would obviously be aware of. And when we couple that with the courtly love tradition, there's a lot of tension there with adultery, etc. So there's high, and when we consider Sir Gawain's moral status as the perfect knight, all of these things are bringing a threat to Gawain. And the question is, who's the hunter and who's the hunted here? Which one of them is the stag? Is Gawain the stag? Is the lady the stag? Which is the noble quarry here?
Yes, it's, I remember the first time I read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I believe I was in second year university. And I remember reading this first seduction scene and being quite surprised. I think it's shocked isn't the right word, but I was very surprised. And I thought to myself, am I missing something about the medieval imagination and medieval society? Were courtly women this bold and forward? Is this normal? And now, of course, that I have a lot more reading experience behind me, I know that no, they're not. The original audience would have found this shocking in the extreme. So I always find it a little bit funny when students or professors accuse the Gawain poet of being a Christian prude.
Yeah.
A prudish development in the narrative. This is quite hair-raising. So first off, a noble woman does not do this.
No.
This is a massive, overwhelming no-go zone. And if a woman does do this, yeah, I think you already said it's unambiguous what's happening here. As soon as she walks through that door, and Gawain knows it's on.
On the other hand, should he insinuate or alert her to the fact that he's aware that she's acting immorally, he will offend her, and if he offends her, then he will lack courtesy, and if he lacks courtesy, he's also failed. So he's on the horns of a dilemma here, the horns of a stag of a dilemma, quite frankly. If he acts and responds to her advances, then he's done. On the other hand, if he acknowledges the fact that she's acting inappropriately, he will also offend her. So he has a serious problem here, and that's part of the humor of the scene.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's exactly the balancing act that Gawain, literally, he's just woken up and he's thrown into this balancing act. He can't say, stop trying to seduce me. This is completely improper and immoral, and how dare you, and, as it were, clutch his pearls and say, get out.
Is that it? Yes.
On the other hand,
Pearl. Sorry. Oh dear.
yes, it's given a bit of an image. I'm trying to shake it myself.
Yes.
But on the other hand, he obviously he can't give in to the advances. Remember, he is Sir Gawain the Chaste, and now the sense of his chastity is quite literal. It wasn't literal when it was signaled at the front end. It was multifaceted, and it connected to the Roman virtue of temperance. But now, of course, it's absolutely on. So how do you? The author absolutely has a blast with this scene.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's delightful because you can see him turn himself in knots trying to be courteous, while she is the antithesis to courtesy, really.
Yes, she's just charging through every boundary.
And yet she is aware of his need to be courteous, so she is pushing him. That's the thing that's so wonderful. It's not that she lacks any awareness of courtesy. She is messing with him and his head on this, and that's what's delightful in it.
And she actually verbally signals that during exchanges. I thought you were the most courteous knight of them all. I thought that was the core of your reputation, and yet you're saying no to me, which is very uncourteous.
Yeah.
So yeah, Gawain has to, as you say, with twists and turns and what have you. It reminds me of an anecdote I heard about Oscar Wilde and how people were putting horrible things essentially into his mouth when it came to what he had said about significant people, and then he had to try to find ways to wiggle out of how he didn't quite mean exactly what they had just said. So also here with Sir Gawain, he has to just find bizarre ways to get out of the situation. And and maybe there's a wider thing that we should talk about here, which will allow a lot of readers to kind of resonate with what Gawain is going through. Traditionally and what I'm about to say here is perhaps a little bit controversial, but that's okay, which is that traditionally in Western society, socially, there are mechanisms and dynamics by which it is not unusual for women to signal the rejection of male advances. And there's kind of a history there, and a set of social conventions which allows them to do that, sometimes rather awkwardly, but nevertheless it's expected. Whereas males traditionally tend to have less machinery with which to do that. How do you reject a woman who's making advances on you? What do you fall back on? What are the conventions here? And there's not a lot going on here. And Gawain finds himself in that unusual situation. Remember, the men are supposed to pursue the women according to courtly love, not the other way around. The Sir Bersalac's lady has turned the world on its head. She's the huntress. She's coming after Gawain.
And he's almost like a woman then.
Yeah, there's a weird challenge to gender roles and who's supposed to be doing what here in a courtly setting. And how do you maintain courtliness in the face of that tension? And Gawain, of course, quite famously, is not sure. But he gets out, let's not call it unscathed. He does not get out unscathed.
No, he does not.
There's a kiss that is inappropriate. And as soon as that happens, there's a betrayal. So
although it's not...
a lot of people say that he fails on the third.
You really think so? I mean, I think it's a common courtesy in that day for people to exchange kisses, though, right? And it's not as suggestive as it would be now for a man to be kissing a woman in that context. Although I'm granting something of what you say, but it's not quite as extreme.
It isn't, because we're never really given the final details on this. Chaucer later makes a distinction between two types of kissing, one of which is perfectly normal and the other which is intimate or too intimate in certain situations, where he talks about kissing with the outer versus the inner lips. I'm just repeating what Chaucer has said.
Of course you are. the other thing that's interesting here is that it's clear that, so against the point that I just made, the lord of the manor wants to know where he got the kiss from, and he suggests that there is something untoward about it as well. Um, and Gawain is really quick to cut him off and said that wasn't part of the agreement. You can't ask that, and then he drops it.
That's right. Again, remember that according to the well-known rules of courtly love, the love has to be secret. It cannot be exposed to the light of day. And so this is very much in Gawain's wheelhouse. This is the kind of stuff he does. So he jumps on that rule, and he's got a get out of jail free card.
Okay, so that's day one. So he pretends he's asleep, first of all, when she comes in. She doesn't go away, and he decides, okay. So day two, second day, the lord of the manor goes out hunting. And what does he hunt the second day?
He goes boar hunting.
Yes.
And
Say something about boars, because we need some sense of what a boar is like in these days.
yeah, we have to remember this is the medieval boar. They are much larger, I think, than a lot of modern urbane readers realize. They can get to enormous sizes. They are extremely powerful pound for pound, as if the size weren't bad enough. They can be extremely fierce. And in fact, the fierceness is legendary in the literary records of the boar.
Yeah.
I don't know if people are familiar with what these things look like. The shoulders on the males are enormous and rise up quite high off the ground. They have a fringe of fur running down their spine, which goes up into what they call the famous razorback.
Yeah.
And you see ancient Greeks are so impressed by the savagery of the boar that they actually imitate that on many of their helmets, where they've got the crest running front to back like a big razorback on the top of their very elaborate bronze helmets. And the Romans have variations of that. Many, many different European cultures have representations of that. So the fierceness of the boar is extremely well known. And the Aberdeen Bestiary has an entry. It's not as elaborate, nor indeed as theologically centered, or as the Stag entry. But I'll just read it for you here, or rather a section of it. And this is the translation, obviously. The boar is so fierce a beast, and also so cruel, that for his fierceness and his cruelness he despises and sets nothing by death, and he pushes on full piteously against the point of the spear of the hunter. Which forces me to talk about a little bit of a practical thing. How do you hunt something like this? Something so big, so fierce. First thing we should know that is typically that boars, even the large male medieval boar, doesn't go looking for trouble for the most part. He keeps himself to himself. But if you go after him, he is one of the most savage beasts in the forest, and that's exactly what Sir Bersilac and his hunt go on to do. And the way traditionally you hunt a boar is you have a special spear, and it's the modern. Well, actually, no. There's a fair number of them in museums. They run about 8 feet long, and you'll notice they have a very thick shaft. Many of them are reinforced with steel strips down either side, riveted on. They have a very, very large spear blade at the end of them, very wide, very long. And then you've got this curious thing about a foot down the shaft. You've got these crossbars, oftentimes iron balls in the end. So what you're supposed to do, if you're dismounting, is that you get that giant boar to charge you. You actually get him to attack you. And as he charges you, you're on the ground, you kneel down, you've got your spear, which is flat on the ground. Just before the boar is upon you with those giant tusks of his, you raise your spear. You oftentimes have it braced against something, a tree or something, and the boar will ram himself.
Impales himself.
Yes, and you use the boar's own strength and savagery against him. But here's what it's talking about in the bestiary, and this was well known. Oftentimes, the boar is so savage and so intent on destroying you that it doesn't care, and it will press itself forward deeper and deeper on that spear blade, and driving it straight into his vitals.
And it's got the tusks, right? That'll
are swinging back and forth on that enormous head. The head probably on some of these things weighs well over 100 pounds itself. And it's only those cross pieces that stop that boar from getting you. And this is what it's talking about here, that it presses itself upon the spear blade and drives forward onto death in order to kill you. You see, actually, if any of our listeners have watched the Lord of the Rings movie,
Yes. They are fighting Urukai. Yeah.
yes, and one of the orcs, actually, this is what happens. He gets stabbed in the chest and he just rams himself forward onto the blade in an attempt to kill his foe. He's behaving very much like a boar. So that's boar hunting 101. And occasionally I'll have students express dismay. Why would anybody then hunt such a creature? And my usual response is bacon.
I was about to say the same. That's a lot of bacon.
A lot of bacon.
Yeah.
And of course, it's a mark of your valor and courage and your skill as a
Sure.
hunter and all these things as well.
So a noble beast to hunt, not as noble as the stag, but still a worthy quarry.
Yes, it is. It's worthy for a different reason. The stag is noble, the boar is fierce. So the stag is hunted for not only his meat, but symbolically perhaps for his nobility. And the boar is hunted obviously for the meat, but also for the valor that's on offer here.
Okay.
The savagery of the fight.
So so that's the hunt of the beast. Now we have the hunt scene that takes place inside the bedroom chamber. And the question of who corresponded to whom there. So who's the noble quarry? Was Gawain the stag in the first, or was it the lady? I mean, she didn't. She certainly was not acting in a Christ-like fashion, shall we say? So
No.
Gawain is the noble quarry. Here he's more fearsome, but is he actually more fearsome here in his responses to her, or is it the other way around? Or is there any parallel to be made even between the two? Because it's not obvious to me in the second hunt scene inside the bedroom that Gawain is like the wild boar. It's not obvious.
I think usually I think of the nature of the hunt corresponding to the nature and the creature that is hunted during that hunt to the nature of the hunt that happens in the bedchamber. So there's a particularly savage battle, if you like, in the bedchamber, but of course it's of an entirely different nature.
Yeah.
The first hunt was, for Bersalak, it was difficult to be sure, but it wasn't as difficult as the second hunt. The second hunt involves that very dangerous boar. Bersalak doesn't kill him with a spear. He actually dismounts and dispatches him. I believe it's with his sword, which is an odd way to hunt boar, but as you like. But it's a dangerous, hard-fought hunt.
Yeah. And that's the ground of parallel there. It seems at the end of this fight, Gawain is at this point recognizing that he was pushed very hard and he does not want a third encounter. He wants to leave at the end of that. Now, so at the end of the first hunt, he gets one kiss from the lady. At the end, he gets two. But having said that, he doesn't want a third day because he has been pressed very hard by the lady. And so there's something of the nature of the encounter and the bloodiness of it and the difficulty for the hunter, or in this case, the one who's being hunted. He wants to get away from that. So he at this point, he says, I want out, and I need to go to the Green Chapel right now.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So he realizes he's at his limits here. If it goes further, he will be overcome.
In some way.
In some senses, yeah. Remember, he's continuously thinking in terms of his virtues and specifically his knightly virtues. And he's got this reputation as such to defend, and he knows that he cannot afford another hunt, another engagement.
And he finds it difficult to be courteous to the lady. And at the same time, I think he also finds it difficult to resist her.
Yes. She is obviously extraordinarily beautiful. We noted this in the previous podcast. She's more beautiful than Guinevere herself. And she's also
not clothed very well.
No, she's showing some skin. This is not a proper Victorian lady, and she's very forward. We have to remember that in spite of what is oftentimes made of it nowadays, medievals, both in the early medieval period and the high medieval period, and especially in England and Northwestern Europe more generally, there was an admiration of a strange sort for what I call the quote-unquote uppity woman. You see this with Chaucer's Wife of Bath. You see this with the Viking figure of Hallgertha Longlegs and what have you. These are women who are very aggressive and know what they want, and they're going to go for it, and they're going to get it.
Mm.
And medieval writers are fascinated, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes fascinated with this kind of a woman. And we see this woman here in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight behaving in this way. She's being extremely forward.
Mm.
And yes, in some senses, it's very off-putting to Gawain, obviously. But on the other hand, it also makes her an object of more intrigue. So
Mm.
he's wrestling with many complicated levels as he's dealing with this woman, and he just wants to get out from under her influence. But he won't, of course.
No, he can't. So he exchanges the two kisses, receives in turn the bacon.
Yep.
Sir Bertilac has brought home the bacon, and
Yeah.
then the third hunt ensues. Now, the third hunt, if I recall, there's some sort of literary. There's a pause. We begin the hunt, and then we shift the scene to Sir Gawain, and then we move back to the hunt. There's a little bit of, it's not direct narrative. It's interspersed a little bit, adding a little tension to the scene. But the third quarry is a fox.
Hmm.
And the fox seems like the least threatening of all the beasts. This is, although to this day we have fox hunting, although I think they sought to abolish fox hunting in England, but the fox is a common quarry for hunters to pursue. And yet there are connotations, if we've seen the first two hunts as pressing and becoming more and more difficult, because the quarry is more challenging. The third seems underwhelming, to put it mildly, and yet there's something about the fox which seems the most threatening of all. And maybe, Bill, you can enlighten us on that.
Yeah. The fox is a common um, symbolic creature encountered in the Middle Ages, whether it's in literature or in carvings and stuff like this, tapestries. The fox is a big player.
It's
Um,
vermin, right? It's vermin. It's a
it is, and the creature is an object of deep fascination to medievals. And in fact, one of the most famous folk heroes in medieval French literature in the Fabliaux is Reynard the Fox.
Reynard Fuchs, yeah, in
He's,
German, yeah.
he's this anti-hero who shows up in one tale after another, and these are ribald comedic tales. And we'll talk about what the Fabliaux is in our next podcast when we're talking about Chaucer. But we have to be clear on what the fox represents to medievals, and it is unambiguous what he represents. And I'm going to read again another entry from the Aberdeen Bestiary. The fox represents the devil, who pretends to be dead to those who retain their worldly ways, and only reveals himself when he has them in his jaws. To those with perfect faith, the devil is truly dead. And you'll find various versions of this same entry in one bestiary after another, after another, after another. They're all clear on what the fox represents.
Mm.
By the way, he is said to be playing dead here because it's said in real life the fox oftentimes pretends to be dead. And when birds of carrion, crows and ravens and what have you come to feast on his dead little corpse, he jumps up and he grabs them, and voila, he's got them. And they say this is like the devil who pretends to be like a non-issue in people's lives until all of a sudden you get close enough to whatever it is that undoes you, and boom, he's got you. And I'm not sure if I
So
can
that
get,
it's sly as a fox we use as a parable to this.
he's tricky, and real foxes the medievals would have known, living much closer to nature than we do, are indeed extremely clever. They're tricky and they're bold and they're audacious, and they're successful predators for a reason, and scavengers for a reason.
And if they get into your chicken coop, they kill every last chicken in the coop. They don't just take what they want or need, they kill everything.
Yeah, it's a myth that they only kill what they need. That's not true. They will kill everything in sight. And they have ways of getting around countermeasures like you would not believe if you're actually hunting them. They have a number of tricks that they use that are really quite extraordinary to get rid of their scent, and they use streams and what have you to likewise hide their trail. They move through cover where they figure dogs and horses can't follow. The hunting of a fox, especially as they did it in the Middle Ages, is very, very difficult. But the purpose of doing so, they're not after the fox for any practical reason.
No.
the fox, and they hunt the fox regularly because of its powerful symbolic nature. They are hunting the wily devil.
They are hunting evil. Yes.
Yes, and that is what I mean. To this day, we oftentimes wonder why do the British, especially the aristocracy, the hunting class, why do they insist on hunting this one thing especially? Because that tradition goes back at least 1,000 years, where they've been hunting the devil out on the in the forests and fields and what have you, and all the stuff that goes along with that traditionally and historically. And if you take that very iconic tradition away from them, you've taken a very, very core part of their tradition away and their identity away. And that's why they defend that so fiercely. Um, as a Canadian, it doesn't make any sense to me why you would do this. But if you understand the tradition behind it and the symbolism behind it, yes, it makes a lot more sense.
Very interesting.
In fact, I may as well tell our listeners here, we lost the video for the previous two episodes. Perhaps down to my fault here, but let's hope we don't lose this one here, because I'm going to try and show you this. Oh, I can't. I cannot. Yeah, the share screen isn't working here. For those of you who watch Paideia today on YouTube or some other venue.
Have you tried it again?
Let me try now. There we go. Got it. Okay. Now, I don't know if I'm going to also, for those of you who are listening to the podcast, I have a woodcut here by Albrecht Dürer, the late medieval artist. And it's, I'm looking at a woodcut called The Night, Death, and the Devil. And go figure, it's a woodcut of the night, death, and the devil behind him. But what I really want to zero in on is here, this thing on the end of the knight's lance. It's a pennant, as many knights' lances would have had. They would have had a flag or some sort of heraldic thing that indicates exactly who you're dealing with. So it wasn't always just the shield that would identify which visored foe you were fighting. It would be also the pennant on the end of the lance. And as Dürer's woodcut shows us here, in this case, it's not a flag, it is a foxtail. Why does the knight have a foxtail on the end of the lance when the devil is literally stalking behind the knight as he rides through the wilds? Because it is a mark that this knight hunts the devil. He fights the devil. That is his foe first and foremost. And it was a reasonably common pennant to find on the knights of lances throughout medieval Europe. And this is what it suggested. And we have a kind of witless holdover of that. For those of you who know anything about 1950s and 1960s hot rod culture, it was not uncommon for people to attach foxtails to the aerial of their hot rod, signaling that they were sort of like some kind of knight errant or something like this. They probably didn't know why they were putting a foxtail on the lance of their aerial, but there you have it. That's the actual explanation behind it.
Wow.
Anyway,
so the different levels on which the hunts are taking place are not only the significance of 1, 2, 3, and we can already trace that the engagement in the bedroom becomes more and more serious, and that Gawain is not only under ever greater duress, but he is actually taking on hits at each time, as you say. But finally, in his encounter, this is almost a diabolical encounter. And the question is, do either of them associate with the devil here? And to some degree, at this point, you almost have to say that the woman becomes like the fox.
Yes.
And the fox, not in its common sense these days, she's a fox, but in the sense that she is almost the embodiment of evil. She is able to insinuate herself into under his scrutiny, and he fails to see the danger. Now, how does she do this? She offers him two things as a gift. So she gives up rather quickly, actually, and in the end offers him first a ring, and the ring that she offers him, he refuses, even though she says that it's a magical ring. And for those who are medievalists, they would know that rings often have magical qualities as well, right?
Yes.
And this one further is it a flaming stone, like a ruby or something on it?
It's not actually called a ruby, but it's called a flaming stone.
Mm.
So a lot of people have thought that this is either a ruby or an amethyst. Amethysts were reasonably common as a decoration for jewelry in this part of the world at this time. Um,
So it's plausible that it does have magical properties, and yet he refuses it.
yes, he does. And again, we could spend the entire podcast talking about the iconographic history of rings in Western literature and stuff like that, but I'm going to be quite brief about this. It may be a magical ring, but you also give rings under two other circumstances here most significantly. There's many different circumstances, but two in particularly. In the early medieval world, you would oftentimes give, if you were a lord, you would give rings to your retainers, and these were powerfully symbolic.
Yes.
A lot of times they would describe the nobility of a lord and the goodness of a warlord as a ring giver. He is a ring giver, so and so the ring giver.
We saw that in Beowulf.
Yes, and it crops up everywhere in medieval literature. So when you give rings, it's a superior who gives a ring to his thanes, to the people over whom he has authority. So there's a weird echo potentially of a chapter.
Of a covenant of sorts, even.
It's very covenantal. You're good. That's true. And there's a second covenant here that is potentially being signaled by the ring. Obviously, rings are given between people who are together, usually in marriage. And this is a tradition that goes right back into Roman times, possibly earlier. It was one of the traditional things that was exchanged and so on and so forth, and certain vows were said. So rings as a symbol of marriage or togetherness at that intimate level goes way back. And I think that probably is a more pressing significance at this point here as well. But maybe you want to say something further about either those levels of the ring, Scott, or about its magical aspects or potentially magical aspects.
Well, I mean, the only reason that the magical aspect might be of interest to him is the fact that he's about to face the Green Knight and lose his head, and so the ring might bestow some sort of protection from that, some sort of immortality or who knows what, but some sort of magical property. So that would be the additional aspect of it, in addition to the significance that's already established that you mentioned with covenantal properties. But it seems like it's the magical qualities that she mentions and the ones that he rejects, but it has the other connotations, and maybe that's why he rejects the other connotations, because he doesn't seem to be averse to the magical qualities, because the second gift that she offers, namely the green girdle or whatever, he does accept because it will protect his life and has magical qualities. So it seems more the implications, the covenantal implications that he's most worried about in the bestowal of the ring, unless it's the fact that everyone will see the ring then, and he will have to give up the ring, and he doesn't want to do that, and there's no point in accepting that sort of thing from her if he's going to have to give it up then.
Yeah, I think it's easy to explain the ring away, and I've heard
so then he becomes like the fox. He becomes foxy, becomes tricky. He has to use a subterfuge in order to deal with his opposite Lord Berchelac there.
Yeah.
So he becomes outfoxed.
He picks up, if we're comparing the nature of the hunt, the first one was a strenuous hunt before a noble creature. The second was an extremely dangerous hunt for a very dangerous creature. And then the third one becomes a downright evil hunt. You're hunting evil and evils and all that brings into our conversation. And so evil now, it's not just raw practical danger. It is evil, deliberate evil that is at work here, and deception, as you say, which is, of course, one of the tools of the devil. And by way of association, it seems that by getting involved in this rather devilish back and forth with the woman, Gawain himself is tainted fundamentally now at that deep, deep level. He's no longer just in danger, he's in danger from evil specifically. And so this works its way into the tapestry of the narrative.
One final thing before you move on with this. I want you to comment on these three hunts and their symbolic significance and how they relate to Beowulf and the three creatures there.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of other things I need to also say here that
Okay.
sort of work off what you said. We tend nowadays to say that some people describe women who are particularly attractive as foxy, or she's a fox or something like that. But we have to understand that that comes from a tradition that is not positive, but negative. Insofar as the fox is associated with the devil, the woman is behaving in a devilish way by using her sexual prowess and stuff like that for nefarious ends, which of course is exactly what we see here. I also want to talk a little bit about fair play, because a lot of students are rather flummoxed by why Gawain's acceptance of the green girdle. Girdle, by the way, is just from the old traditional name for belt. It doesn't mean what it means in modern English. And so sometimes we translate that as the green sash because it seems to get treated like a sash later on in the narrative. It's just something that belts around you.
Yep.
Anyway, a lot of students are rather flummoxed by why it's such a bad thing to accept that sash or that belt. And we have to remember that this is a world whose principles center heavily on not just courtliness, but also chivalry. And so their notion of fair play is taken to an extreme that sometimes shocks us. And the idea here is that, well, you know, the Green Knight obviously had magical help in getting beheaded and walking out with the head and what have you. So if he's cheating using magic, surely it is fair for Gawain to cheat a little bit using magic. No, according to the chivalric code, even if your opponent cheats, that does not excuse you cheating right back. Not at all. You're supposed to be better than him. You're not supposed to be brought down to his level.
Right.
And so, no, it's not fair, according to the codes of chivalry, for Gawain to do that, because now he's lowering himself to the level of the evil people, the bad guy.
Right.
And he's supposed to hold himself above that kind of behavior.
Right.
So one thing I want to throw out there very quickly.
That's a great point.
And the other business here, you were talking about the three monster battles in Beowulf. And I don't remember to what extent we got into this off the top of my head, but I remember saying, and I say this usually whenever I teach Beowulf, there's a sequence to the evils that are faced in Beowulf in the monster hunts, the three monster hunts. When he battles Grendel, he's battling the evil of the real world, the everyday world. I mean, there are dangerous things that come at you in the real world. They're your opponents. It might be an enemy warrior. It could be circumstances. It could be something very abstract, something very concrete. But this is everyday dangerous stuff that comes at you.
And it's noble to fight such things.
Sure. Yes, it is good and noble to fight back against such things. No worries. The second monster battle in Beowulf was, of course, against Grendel's mother. And she was fulfilling in her murderous intent a legal obligation according to the codes of that culture. So now you're dealing with the evil of the law. You know, there are certain biblical connotations that feed into this as well, particularly I think in the book of Romans, where we could actually riff off of a lot of things where the law condemns, the law, it will kill, the law will punish. And there's nothing you can do about it, because remember, Beowulf is being written by a Christian. And so that's a second kind of an evil, kind of almost mindless evil. Was the law violated? Yes. Could you avoid violating the law? No. Are you going to be punished? Yes. Oh, okay, well, my position is impossible without grace. Now, the third battle is the dragon. And Tolkien makes this point. This is not my point. Tolkien makes this point about the dragon. He says, you have to be aware that the dragon is not interested in speaking the language even of good and evil. It is the evil we encounter in the world. You don't, the avalanche that comes down the mountainside and wipes out the orphanage. Can you say, stop, that's evil, don't do that? It's not going to matter. The avalanche doesn't speak your language. Life doesn't speak your language. That's the horrible thing about the dragon. It won't say that it's beyond good and evil, to get rather Nietzschean about it here. Yep. Now, there's, as you say, there's a sequence.
Amoral.
Yeah. And which, by the way, quite chillingly, I think is where many thinkers find themselves nowadays in the wake of postmodernism. It's all about hegemonics. I won't speak about good and evil anymore, or right and wrong, but we'll come to that much later. But with the sequence of hunts here, again, we've got the number 3, and we start off with this noble, strenuous hunt, as you say. Then we move into the second hunt, where it's tremendously dangerous at the natural level. And then we have a third hunt, where evil comes into the picture. With the Beowulf, the last battle, evil moves out of the picture. That's the problem with that last battle. Here, evil actually comes in and says, this is not just dangerous, this is evil. So let's consider what evil is. And now we're going to get ourselves involved in the dynamics of evil And Gawain does. That's precisely what he does. And that's the fall itself right there.
Yeah, but so my thought on that, just everything you said, and then the additional fact that the serpent and the dragon are often associated. So the devil and the dragon in Christian iconography and even in biblical understanding, often the serpent of the seas, the Leviathan, is often seen as a sort of a dragon figure. And here we've connected the fox with, again, the devil. And so there's a sort of association there as the third and the final form of this. And here it's really the personification of evil in the form of this figure. And he brings Gawain down, as he brings everyone down for that matter. So Gawain is defeated here by a foxy opponent, and he himself acts like a fox to evade the foxiness of his opponent. So he becomes a little bit too subtle for his own good here, trying to avoid, out of fear of his own life, but nonetheless to avoid doing something wrong, he does something else that is wrong.
You know, just as you were saying that, it occurred to me, you know, those students who say because the Green Knight had used magic to cheat,
Doesn't count.
it justifies Gawain cheating, in turn using magic. But just what you said here about the fox is interesting, because by fighting the fox, he's adopted fox methods.
That's the thing.
In,
That's exactly it.
and Gawain cheating,
Yep.
okay, will be bad, and he does it. He does the bad. And fighting the devil and taking on devilish tactics to fight the devil, and thereby becoming like the devil himself in certain senses. So there's a tainting by doing that. You can't fight the devil using devilish methods. You have to use other methods, which Gawain doesn't do. And if there is something that is his spiritual undoing in this text, I think it's that. It's bound up in that.
So he exchanges the 3 kisses that he received from the lady, but refuses to hand over and does not even make the Lord aware of the fact that he's also received the green girdle / sash, which he then wears under his clothes as he rides out to face the Green Knight.
Yes. And a lot of students think that not declaring and handing over the sash is the fall. No, that's simply a making manifest of the fall that has already happened. He fell when he accepted it, not when he didn't hand it over.
Yes.
So this is all just follow through at this point.
So this is just the fruits of the wickedness. And now in addition to that, he's also trying to conceal his guilt, of which he's aware.
Yes, you don't hide something if you're not ashamed of it. And he does hide it. And this brings up another sort of perennial leitmotif that you and I have been bouncing back and forth pretty well since the beginning of Paideia today, which is this notion that the pursuit of virtue, in this case chivalric virtue and courtly virtue, like all these other pursuits of heroism, is something that necessitates a willingness to die for it. You must be willing to fight and die for these sorts of things. And here we're seeing the high medieval Christian chivalric reiteration of this notion again. They don't reject old models of heroism necessarily. They adapt many of them and they convert many of them to their purposes here. Gawain fears for his life, and he is willing to sacrifice his chivalric honor in order to save it. You can't do that if you're a chivalric hero. No. You, like all the heroes who've gone before, you have to be willing to risk it all. And he does not do that. So this is a very standard fall of heroic status. And interestingly, by the end of it, it seems that Gawain not only knows it, he knows it in great depth and complexity in the ways that the other knights around him do not, as they signal by taking up his token of shame as a token of honor. But we'll come to a moment.
We'll come to that in a moment. So now he moves on and he goes to seek out the Green Knight in the Green Chapel, and he finds him, to skip over a bit, and hears him sharpening his axe behind a hill, comes around and sees this enormous character. And the Green Knight greets him, congratulates him on arriving. And I think even before this, somebody tries to, I'm trying to remember, is there somebody that tries to discourage him from going there? He could run off and he doesn't do that. Is that before this? I can't remember now.
Thinking back here, I think you're right, but unfortunately, I'm not pulling up details here. It's actually been at least a year since I've
Okay.
read it. So
So at any rate, he faces the Green Knight and he puts his head down in order to take the stroke. And the Green Knight feints at him. So in other words, he brings the axe up to as if to strike off his head. And at that point, Gawain flinches a little bit
that's
because
right.
I think maybe even a little bit of water droplet falls down anyway. But anyway, he flinches at the impending blow, and then he gets a serious taunting.
Yes, the Green Knight has no problem in highlighting and mocking Gawain's cowardice. And again, my modern students um, are a little bit perplexed by this because they say, well, obviously he's about to have his head struck off. Who wouldn't flinch? And your standard response is, Sir Gawain, Knight of the Round Table. That's who. Remember, this is idealized romance. This is not
Right.
a realistic narrative
Right.
in most senses. And Gawain is furious that he has let himself down as such. And we're seeing a harbinger
His
of,
favorite is crimson, I think.
yes, and notable color at this point in time. And this is, in my view, the beginning of his horrible self-awareness of what he has done and how he has fallen. But say more, Scott.
Well, I mean, and then there's a second feint. At this time, he doesn't flinch, and yet he still gets mocked. And at this point, he is just furious and get on with it and do your worst and so forth. But there's a second refusal to strike his head by the Green Knight. And at this point, then we recognize that the three passes are meant to symbolize the three temptations and so forth, right? But right.
And this, yes, and this gets made explicit. And of course, with the third blow, he deliberately just nicks him and leaves it.
Yes.
And, there's a trickle of blood at this point here, and
Yeah.
again, we have that signal of red. Now the red of the holly berries and all that stuff has come full circle, and now it actually is blood being shed in a sacred place for some reasons that seem to be bound up with this greenness and all that involves, and so on and so forth. And we see the negative connotations, of course, of green here as well. We've been talking about green in positive senses, but that sash is not positive at all. It represents evil. It's a poisonous green, if you like, but especially at that moral level. And notice Gawain's response immediately upon receiving the nick and realizing he's still alive. He jumps up, he grabs his weapon, and if you want a fourth blow, you're going to have to go through him to get it. So again, it highlights an ideal, and I might have mentioned this in previous podcasts.
But now he's not acting like the courageous knight. He's acting like a man who has lost his moral virtue and is just angry like a beast.
Well, he's fighting for the one thing he seems to have left, his mortal life.
His mortal life, and that's it.
About honor and reputation and heroism and stuff like that has been compromised, and so he's just an animal fighting like the other animals who were hunted in the previous 3 hunts. And he fights back with the fierceness of the fox or the boar or whatever you want to call it. But he's, in some senses, he's removed from the highest idealized state of men, and
he's been degraded to and lost his manliness in the virtuous sense of it.
Yep.
And to make matters worse, the Green Knight forgives him because he feared for his life, but by that supposed forgiveness, he's reduced Gawain to being a man without virtue.
Yeah, it's like, well, of course you feared for your life. You're just a human being, but that the emphasis on the word just. You were this great towering figure, Sir Gawain, Knight of the Round Table. Now you're just somebody who fears for their life like a normal everyday guy, and your reputation is gone. And well, I guess why wouldn't you behave like this?
And then the Green Knight puts all of his cards on the table, reveals that he is Sir Bertilac, and furthermore that he's the nephew of Morgan Le Fay, who was the old lady accompanying his beautiful wife, and it was a plot that had been hatched, etc., etc. Now, do you want to say anything more about that? Because now we're getting into, there's an intrigue here, and it seems to be a much deeper problem than simply bringing down this man. It seems directed at the court of King Arthur and with Arthur, the Camelot and the representation of what that symbolizes on earth, which is the Christian perfection, as it were.
Yeah, Galahad is the knight who eventually attains the Holy Grail, if you don't know the legends. The perfect knight, they call him. And everybody else fails. And you could say even that Galahad is problematized in that status. How can there be perfection in this world when that is God's and the realm of the heavenly city and all that stuff?
And it's the second coming and so forth, yes.
Exactly. So are they in the pursuit of something which they cannot possibly attain? And much of this is bound up with questions of the reputation, not just of individual knights like Gawain, but the round table overall as a concept. We talked a little bit about this in relatively broad, crude strokes, as by necessity we had to, around the great hall of Heorot, the hall of Rothgar and the Spear Danes,
In Beowulf, yeah.
Beowulf, which becomes famous not for the hall itself, not even for the valor of the thanes and the warlords who inhabit it, but for the sort of fraternity, the nobility, the beauty. They talk about it almost like it's an awe-inspiring artistic object. There is a fraternity amongst these people, a brotherhood that exists in there, that is a work of art that all the world marvels at. Even more so, in different terms, you see this kind of conversation crop up again and again around Arthurian material. The concept of the Round Table represents a fraternity of knights who are legendarily noble and virtuous and what have you. Their physical prowess is just kind of an outplay. Cruder readers will get distracted by that. But at the end of the day, what most people who are reading at a high level are interested in when it comes to conversations around the Round Table is the fraternity that is built up there. And again, as with Heorot, the author at the end of Beowulf comments that, it's a thing of this world and all the good things of this world must pass, including this beautiful fraternity of Heorot. So also, this earthly fraternity of the Round Table must pass away. And we'll see Mallory make a great deal of this actually in the De Morte d'Arthur. But we have many echoes and hints towards it over here. Now, here's one of the questions a lot of professors pose around the plot of Morgan Le Fay in Gawain and the Green Knight. Is she seeking to expose the rot at the heart of this fraternity, or is she seeking to cultivate rot at the heart of this fraternity? And how we answer that question is going to change everything about how we approach all things Arthurian. We also have to take into account, and we've mentioned this before, that according to chivalric thinking and courtly thinking, suffering, fighting, and undertaking the quest had very much as part of its dynamic this notion of refinement. Something can be refined and refined and refined again. Can it be refined to perfection? I think the end conclusion around Arthurian conversations is no. The Knights of the Round Table and everyone around them realize that no, there's a lot of refining, and refining is good, but it has its limits. And then the rest is the work of God, he who is perfect himself. And Gawain, shatteringly at the end of this tale, comes to know this as well. Yes, I've been refined by suffering, by a fall. I've been refined by a fall, and what I've learned from that fall. But now,
so let's talk about that in relation to the conclusion when he goes back to the court and he's wearing the sash around his, now no longer hidden, but across his chest as a sign of his shame, we're told.
Yes.
The court responds in kind, wearing the green sash, which will be the order of the green sash, which is kept to this very day, is it not?
I'm not sure. It might be. But I mean, they're taking it on as a symbol of humility, but they're proud of their humility, and they get into that whole weird dynamic. Lewis talks about that, by the way, at a certain point, how, you can
pride in your humility. Yeah.
Yeah. This sort of ping pong game in your head of being humble and then being proud of your humility. But of course,
so humble.
Humility, then you're not humble, and you go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And he says the only way to win that game is not to play that game. And he's right, I think. And here we find likewise, I mentioned at the end of the last podcast, another point by Tolkien about this tale, where you see this rise in the Green Chapel of the figure of the Green Knight / Bersilac. and how all of a sudden that laughing, dangerous, buffoon-like character kind of rises quietly in nobility and looks sadly, as it were, down on the fallen Gawain. And he's no longer a buffoon. He's somebody who's actually wiser than anyone else around. He was just playing the buffoon to play certain or get certain things to happen. Likewise, you have a very melancholy, wise Gawain at the end, surveying the Knights of the Round Table as they traipse about in their green sashes and what have you, not getting what he got. Gawain does come out of this far end sadder than he went in, obviously, fallen, but also wiser in certain grim, dark ways. And this comes back to another sort of axiomatic thing we've been encountering throughout the literature we've been talking about, which is that the result of too much wisdom is great sadness.
Yes.
In Odyssey, we see this in Norse mythology. The people who went out and attained great wisdom are some of the most melancholy figures of them all. And some of them even express regret about having become as wise, in this case, morally and chivalrically wise as they have. And now they look at the world in a rather different way. Gawain has attained wisdom, and it has not made him happy. And this is a very expected, I mean, if you know your readings, this is a rather expected outcome at the end of the day.
Okay, so the conclusion, the French words, "Honi soit qui mal pense," sounds like the motto of an order of a new garter. But as you said, there is no such order that is established in the 18th century. So it's the pretense of it. Are these knights wearing the green sash something like Uriah Heep's, then, the sort of Dickensian humble characters who, as you say, pretend humility and really are lacking in awareness, or are proud of their humility, basically. So they're just peacocks and they've been exposed as such. And my final question is, why does the author of this give us this tale, concluding in this form? Like, what's the purpose here, the didactic purpose even?
There is more of a didactic purpose to much medieval literature than there are in other genres, perhaps. And the reputation of Gawain throughout Arthurian literature is amongst other things, of humility. Gawain is famously humble. This is the one knight who usually has a pretty clear image of himself, doesn't put himself out there if he can help it, is the guy who quietly helps in the background and lets the credit go to other people. This is very much classic Gawain. And I think strategically, this might have something to do with why the author chose this tale and this figure in this tale, because even that Gawain needs to understand the nature of his own humility and how low he actually stands and where he actually is within sort of the moral universe of things. He is not the best of knights because of his humility. He realized he's one of the worst of knights because of the way he's dealing with these sorts of things, and he still has much to learn. So, as I said, he is a refined character at the end, but not in ways that are going to make him happy. This is not a happy story. And if you read some of the other works, like, for instance, Purity or Pearl or what have you, that these other tales that occur in the same manuscript collection, you will see similar notions being put forward, especially by the end of these poems, whereby the protagonist realizes that they have been arrogant in various complex ways that have brought them low and given the devil, as it were, and the world a foothold, and death a foothold in their lives. So this aligns quite well, I think, with the other texts and readings thematically of those texts around humility.
So in spite of all of the allegorical levels in which it can be read and the richness of the literary fabric, and the presentation of evil in heraldic terms and so forth, which suggests almost a distance from the world, it's an intensely practical lesson that's being taught here through all of this. And that really, I think for the reader, we have little difficulty recognizing the problem that Gawain has embroiled himself in, and so it remains. And this is the thing that's surprising about it almost, when you start to see a literary fabric being woven and all of the levels in which you can read it, you tend to think that it's not really going to have an application, but it really does seem to have an application.
Yeah, we come back to this. I oftentimes see Sir Gawain and the Green Knight read and or taught in largely, if not entirely, secular contexts.
Yeah.
And I think that that is a real impoverishment, a massive fundamental impoverishment around this story here. They talk, sometimes I will hear or read writers who talk about the text as if the Christian world that Gawain inhabits is almost contingent. It's just, you know, it just happens to be the culture, but it could have been embedded in a number of other cultures.
Yeah.
We have to remember that the author is first and foremost not just an aristocrat, not just learned. He is a Christian, and he thinks deeply about his faith and his faith life, as is demonstrated in the other texts that we encounter. And I would argue, as is demonstrated in this text here, and if that's not foregrounded when we read this text and try to make sense of it, I think we have done ourselves a profound disservice.
Well, this is brilliant. Thank you very much, Bill. I found this really interesting. So you said we're going to go on next time to talk about Chaucer with...
Yes, Chaucer, and we're primarily going to focus he's like many great authors out there. Chaucer never thought that the text for which he is now famous would be the text that makes him famous, and probably would have been appalled by it. We're going to be looking at the Canterbury Tales, and because we've only got a limited amount of time, we're only going to look at one of the tales. We're going to look at the Pardoner's Tale, but we probably could have looked at the Wife of Bath's Tale or the Miller's Tale, also with great profit. But the scope of what we can do here on Paideia today, of course, constrains us to
That's fine.
things workable. And so we'll come back and we'll discuss that and see where Chaucer's merry medieval world takes us.
Great. Wonderful. All right. Well, I'm Scott Masson with Paideia Today and Dr. Bill Friesen. We shall see you next time. Thank you.
Take care.